So turning to, again, staying on international focus for a moment, the arrest of Martin Lee in Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai, the increased skirmishing in the South China Sea, do you get a sense that the PRC is testing its limits internationally, that they're pushing harder on certain issues internationally that they have been trying to, things they've been trying to achieve for a long time, that they've lost patience. They're pushing harder on these issues than they have before. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not new either. It's something that we saw really under the present leadership in China and under the leadership of Xi Jinping. And the old dung adage about whatever, biting your time,
right?
That's clearly, that's long gone. And so I do think that we're going to continue to see that. I do also think, though, that that China is going to be facing really, really significant economic headwinds, the likes of which they haven't seen in many, many years going forward. And so how that affects their push overseas, sort of a soft power or hard power push overseas, is an open question. We'll have to see how that unfolds.
So it's possible that they could have really a series of very tough problems on their hand if they have steep unemployment at home. At the same time, there's some sort of international pushback. Can you imagine or envision a time in which that Xi Jinping could have pushed too hard on his agenda, and that maybe there is a moment of reckoning for him?
I think that what's happening in the economy and the pushback that's happening internationally, as well as you bring up, are challenges to him. And it's no secret to any of us that there are people within China and powerful people that aren't all happy with everything with all of the leadership of Xi Jinping. So that's sort of and that's true of any leader in China and true of any leader in the world, frankly. So I do think that that is an issue. On the sort of push overseas, one thing I just note is we don't know what if things get harder in China. One possibility is they do, they fan the flames of nationalism, and they do something beyond their borders in the South China Sea or Taiwan, and do that in order to actually try to drum up support for their own people, from their own people, even as they lose sort of the economic lever to drum up support. And that's a possibility too. So we don't really know how this all unfolds, even as China faces more and more challenges going forward economically.
So do you see any sign of countries, Chinese are on the move around the world, as we know, in astonishing numbers with astonishing amount of money. Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Italy, Greece, Costa Rica, El Salvador, everywhere. Do you see any sign that countries are saying, you guys got us sick and we're not as enthusiastic about your presence here, or you're asserting your interests too aggressively, and we're losing enthusiasm for your version of globalization? Do you see any signs of that?
Maybe there were already signs of that before this latest chapter that we're dealing with COVID-19. So yeah, there's signs of that. The open question is the degree to which they can use the present crisis that the world's facing to whether they can use it to actually build up their status overseas or not. And as I said earlier, they have a foil in the failures of the U.S. government dealing with COVID-19, unfortunately, which makes it much easier for them to present themselves as a good model to the world. And they've been doing that obviously with exports of PPE and to different countries around the world. There's been pushback, but nevertheless, they'll continue to do it. It would be interesting to see what happens.
Need China for dams and bridges, and they're the people you can go to and get dams, bridges, ports, all that. So, and now they're the people to go to get the PPEs and the other equipment you need. Talk about U.S.-Chinese relations. We've had a so-called Donald Trump's trade war, tariffs, a lot of bombast, sparring in the South China Sea. What do you think that this will exacerbate U.S.-Chinese conflict, or will it result in some denouement where they both recognize that they have common interests. I see the Chinese ambassador Cui saying that it's time to have a fundamental review of the relationship. Where do you see it going?
Well, first on the trade war, I think that it's far from resolved. And the phase one agreement that we saw earlier really was sort of just a doorstopper. The Chinese side promised to make big acquisitions, big purchases, mainly of agricultural goods. And the difficult stuff, dealing with issues like coercive technology transfer requirements when you do business in China, subsidies, both direct and implicit, and uneven implementation of policies for foreign companies versus Chinese companies. All those things are still very much alive, and that was supposed to be saved for a second phase agreement. I don't anticipate a second phase agreement coming anytime soon at all. And I should say, those, interestingly, what the US government says that it wants solved with the second phase agreement, and I understand why, because I think in many cases there are unfair trading and investment practices by China, are interestingly the same things that I was hearing about when I first showed up in China in the mid-90s and started writing about the US-China trade and investment relationship. So whether it was poor protection of intellectual property rights, or it was coercive technology transfer requirements, and so on. That's what I was writing about in the mid-90s, in the late 90s, and kept writing about it right up until I left. And the reason why it's still there is because I think that those policies actually are very important to the Chinese idea, this ideal of trying to transform the economy to a much more globally strong global technology power. And so it makes me very pessimistic that we're actually going to come to any agreement.
I would agree with you.
China wants to continue to use those policies for its own interests. And it's pretty understandable.
I would agree with you that the Made in China 2025 and the various technology platforms that they are trying to achieve and conquer the various technologies, that to say to them, we don't want you to support your state-owned enterprises in their pursuit of these technologies is a non-starter. I mean, it's like the British with their warships in 1840 and the Opium Wars, that this is clearly an attempt by outside powers to force them to give up something that's really very important to them. So I would agree that that's highly unlikely. So
when we didn't hear about Made in China 2025, it wasn't because they abandoned that as a policy. And by the way, before Made in China 2025, we had indigenous innovation, right, which we wrote a lot about at Business Week. And these goals of trying to use what the U.S. administration has been arguing are sort of state planning, unfair trading practices are, they're very integral, and they have been for a very long time, to sort of this Chinese model of economic development. So yeah, I don't think that's going away. On the other side, the U.S., I mean, ultimately, I see the sort of the competition as one between sort of an aging superpower, which is the U.S., which has no desire to see, someone else come on the scene and start to chip away at the power that the U.S. has had for these years. And you have the Chinese, on China's side, quite naturally, a rising superpower, which obviously wants to see itself play a much larger role globally. And I don't think ultimately that conflict can be resolved anytime soon at all, if ever.
It reminds me of the Americans negotiating the Structural Impediments Initiative with Japan in the 1980s, that there were structural impediments that the Americans thought they could get the Japanese to resolve. But of course, those very structure of the Japanese economy was giving them economic momentum, and they weren't in the slightest bit interested in resolving those structural impediments.